All right. So the next story here, declassified documents show that the U.S. knew Russia felt snookered by NATO. So this article is from Responsible Statecraft, and it is based on a pretty big release of documents by the National Security Archive. They released a set of documents about, events that took place during the Clinton administration regarding NATO expansion that show the U.S., the Clinton administration, was well aware that Russia wasn't going to be happy, that, it could provoke Russia, and that it was bad for U.S.-Russia relations. Obviously, they knew this stuff, but you have people sort of denying some of these realities these days, So I love how they published it this week during the summit. So I'll read a little bit of it. This article is from Blaze Malley at Responsible Statecraft. So in their post on the documents, the National Security Archive wrote, quote, "The documents show that the Clinton administration's policy in the 1990s, emphasizing two tracks of both NATO enlargement and Russian engagement, often collided, leaving lasting scars on then Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who constantly sought what he called partnership with the U.S. But as early as fall 1994, according to documents, the Partnership for Peace Alternative Security Structure for Europe, which included both Russia and Ukraine, was de-emphasized by U.S. policymakers who only delayed NATO enlargement until both Clinton and Yeltsin could get through their re-elections in 1996, end quote. So in 1995, then National Security Advisor Anthony Lake warned President Bill Clinton that Russian leadership would not accept the expansion of the alliance to the east. Lake wrote, quote, "Russian opposition to NATO enlargement is unlikely to yield in the near or medium term to some kind of grudging endorsement. Russia's opposition is deep and profound. For the period ahead, the Russian leadership will do its level best to derail our policy, given its conviction that any eastward expansion of NATO is at root antithetical to Russia's long-term interests," end quote. 2 years later, as Washington and Moscow were entering negotiations on the future of NATO-Russia cooperation, State Department official Dennis Ross wrote that what the archive calls an astute and empathetic analysis of the Russian position on NATO expansion. He said, quote, "To begin with, the Russians, for all the reasons you know, see NATO expansion through a political, psychological, and historical lens. First, they feel they were snookered at the time of German unification, as you noted with former Secretary of State James Baker's promises on not extending NATO military presence into what was East Germany were part of a perceived commitment not to expand the alliance eastward." That's another thing that people deny, that the U.S. said that they wouldn't expand NATO eastward. There's kind of a misnomer with that. People say that, they deny it. They say, the U.S. did not promise that it wouldn't expand NATO to the east. There's no treaty about that. That's kind of the whole thing, is that it was never put in writing, but the U.S. officials did say it in these meetings with Soviet officials. More confirmation of that right here. So, that was one of Putin's things, was that he wanted it in writing. He wanted something, a treaty or something, or an agreement. Anyway, so there's a lot of good stuff in here. Because these perceived promises were never made concretely, Ross says the Russians were, quote, "taking the lessons of 1991 and are trying to apply them now in the negotiations on NATO expansion," end quote. Despite these roadblocks, Clinton and his Russian counterpart Boris Yeltsin nonetheless reached an agreement on a series of issues at a summit in Helsinki 1 month later. During a private conversation with Clinton at the summit, which was part of the set of declassified documents, Yeltsin would say that he reached an agreement with NATO, not because he wanted to, but because it is a forced step. And that was the 1997 Russia-NATO founding document or something. And NATO agreed not to establish permanent bases, basically east of Germany, but they're doing that now. That's they do tricky things with that. They'll deploy troops to Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and say, oh, it's not a permanent deployment, but, they rotate troops out, and there's always U.S. troops there, but they say, oh, it's not permanent. But now they are building permanent bases. I know they did one in Poland, and I think they're doing more in the Baltic states.